All right, I'm happy to be joined today by a very special guest, my brother, Rick Rauser. And we're going to be talking about depression. Depression is a topic that I've actually been asked about a couple times in the last couple months by people, that if I would say something about it, and I don't know a lot about depression. And so I thought my brother would be a great person to talk about. Now, I'm rudely looking down here for a reason. And the reason is because I wanted to segue our discussion by showing you an album that meant a big deal to me many years ago. And so it's a Larry Norman album. Larry Norman is, I think, widely reputed to be the godfather of Christian rock music, or the father of Christian rock music, is whatever the expression is. And so one of his albums, called Something New Under the Sun, was his exploration of the blues. And it came out in 1981, and I have it somewhere on cassette, which I bought in like 83. I ended up seeing Larry in concert 10 years later in 1993. He's since passed away. But this is a fascinating album. And so now I'm stuck and listening to it on my phone. Here are some of the titles for songs: Hard Luck, Bad News, Feeling So Bad, I Feel Like Dying, Born to Be Unlucky, Watch What You're Doing. So one of them, like, I feel like dying. That's how the one song begins. I've done all I can. I lost my woman. She ran off with another man. And I thought, like, what Christian sings music like this? This is just fascinating. A true story, and I'm rambling here, and I'm going to introduce Rick in just a second here, but true story. I wanted to do a band, an air band at Christian youth camp. And I wanted to do a song by a Christian blues singer, not Larry Norman, but I forget it. Larry Howard actually was his name. And he had a Christian blues song. And the youth pastor, my brother knows, and I won't give his name, but he said, Brother Randy, I'm sorry, you can't do that because a Christian cannot sing the blues. So it was considered unchristian to do a Christian blues band. And so Larry Norman, way back in the early 80s, like 40 years ago almost, he stuck out to me as someone who was dealing with the full range of human experience.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, Rick was a high school teacher for many years, and a beloved one at that. I can say that because I heard on many times from his students, in fact. And he also, in the last few years, has been working as a healthcare aide, total career change. But he's also had a long time interest in depression that I think is an autodidact or self-taught, somewhat of a master, I think, in terms of understanding a lot of the different angles of depression. So I'm going to pitch it over to you, Rick, with just an introductory question. What is depression?
Well, I don't know if I'd call myself a master on this topic, but I think of myself as a student of the topic. For many years, as you said, I was a high school teacher. I did teach Psychology 12, grade 12 high school course, Psychology 12 for many years, among many other things. And I always did a very large segment of the course dealing with what is called abnormal psychology in the field of psychology, which encompasses mental illness. And so we talked about depression there, of course. So I certainly did a lot of study for that portion of the course. I also have, as part of my teacher training, I did courses in educational psychology, and just as part of my undergrad, I took some psychology courses. So I have a little bit of a background in it, very, very small background in it. But I think more importantly for me, it's a topic that comes out of my own experience. I am somebody who has dealt with depression my whole life. So I am 50 years old, and it's probably not an exaggeration to say I have dealt with depression for maybe 45 of those years. I think the first time that I remember being depressed, I was probably about, 11 or 12 years old. But I remember my dad, your dad too, of course, telling me once that when I was 3 years old, I didn't want to go to sleep one night because I was scared I wouldn't wake up in the morning. And
That is so existential.
yeah, it is. And it's also very atypical. And
Mhm.
and I realize as an adult, that kind of fear it is kind of pathological, right? Especially if it's an ongoing kind of thing. So anyway, I to answer your question as simply as I think can be answered, the word depression encompasses a wide range of conditions which all have in common that they are considered mental illness. They are considered to inhibit normal functioning, and that they sort of put a person potentially at some kind of risk uh, of self-harm, or of course in the extreme of suicide. It's generally considered to be one of the leading causes of disability globally. Depending on what studies you look at, some say it is the number one cause of disability. Uh, Back in the day, people used to use terms like nervous disorder or mental breakdown, and or nervous breakdown. These are all terms that people would used to use, and really that is those kind of words, are sort of euphemisms for what we today would recognize as mental illness. And certainly as far as mental illness goes, it is by far one of the most common of the mental illnesses. It is estimated by the World Health Organization that 260 million people, so just over a quarter of a billion, suffer from some form of clinical depression. And it's important to remember that the word is not a great word, because we use the word depression in ordinary speech. People will say, oh, I'm so tired of all these wildfires. I'm so depressed by all this. Or, my favorite team lost at the Olympics, or my country lost at the Olympics. I'm so depressed. Like, people use the word in a colloquial manner, which is somewhat misleading, because actual depression, sometimes people call it clinical depression to try to give some differentiation, but actual depression is something quite different from that ordinary experience that we all have of feeling kind of down or bummed out or discouraged.
Is there a distinction there that you're making between, like Larry Norman says, I feel like dying because his woman left him? So there's an environmental factor there. Like, I'm tired of the wildfires, my team lost, my woman left me, I'm depressed, versus a clinical depression that doesn't necessarily have an object, which is the catalyst of the depression.
Well, both things can be true. So a person who is prone to depression uh, can sometimes experience it for no reason at all. You feel this overwhelming sense of sadness, of despair, of hopelessness. But not only that, you feel this overwhelming sense of guilt, not over anything in particular, just this kind of generalized guilt, feeling that the universe is out to get you. Again, not in a psychotic sense where you actually think there's something out there to get you, but just where you just feel that everything is against you. That can come for no reason at all. But on the other hand, it is also true that clinical depressive episodes can be triggered by external causes. So it's not always easy to differentiate genuine clinical depression from grief or sorrow or sadness if there are environmental factors. So a really good example is the death of a spouse, let's say. Suppose your beloved wife dies, or your beloved husband dies, whatever the case is. It's completely normal and healthy and appropriate to feel sadness and to feel sorrow. But wanting to kill yourself because your spouse has died is not normal. And you can get pretty close to that desire without being in danger of acting on it. And so it's not always easy to differentiate that. It's normal to feel very sad and discouraged and grief, and all those are normal, healthy human emotions. They can be caused by real external things. But those real external things can also trigger a kind of pathological episode.
I want to explore the link between depression and rationality. So I'll set this up, take a minute to set it up. So on the one hand, I'm just spitballing here, but I think approximately about 70% of people have an optimism bias, that they tend to think their life circumstances are more optimistic and more favorable than the evidence warrants. I'm smarter than average, I'm better looking than average, I have better job prospects than average, and so
I
on.
agree with all of those things.
Yeah, so you can't have 70% of the people can't be right. And then there's another subset that maybe have a pessimism bias as well. But we could think, first of all, that, well, the person who has a more rational, non-biased perspective of their own life prospects, maybe they will be more inclined to depression because of that. And so maybe depression is more closely aligned with, in fact, truth and rationality. And just to follow that through even a little bit further, I'm thinking about Woody Allen as an example, where he describes, of course, a famous filmmaker with a very tattered moral record. We'll just, of course, acknowledge that.
A checkered past.
Checkered past, yes.
Yeah.
Not all of his movies aged well. Manhattan has not aged well, for example. Having said that,
Nope.
No. But having said that, so he said at one point how he's reflecting on his own mortality as a child. And of course, he has family, I think, were survivors of the concentration camps, I mean, obviously Jewish background. And so that's the context for the metaphor he uses. He sees his friends playing and being happy, and he says, "We're all going up in a smokestack soon. What are you so happy about?" Or something like that. And so there's this sense where he struggles with depression, but it's because he has a more accurate understanding of what it is to be human.
Yeah. Yeah, there's even a term for that. It's called depressive realism. There's actually been some interesting studies done on the ability of people with clinical depression to accurately perceive threats or danger in the environment. For example, there was one study done, I don't remember the university, but it was one of the major American, Stanford or something like that. It was one of the major American schools. They did a study of people with depression and people who had never been diagnosed with depression and had never reported any feelings of depression. And they had them play a video game, a fairly simple video game where they shoot robots or kill robots, with their little man and their joystick. And then after the game, they asked them to estimate how many they had destroyed. And the people with depression, there was an overwhelming difference. They were far closer in their estimate to how many they had actually destroyed. So the people with depression, just to make up numbers as an example, they would say, well, I think I destroyed about 30% of the robots that I fought in the game. The people without depression tended to wildly overestimate, and they tended to say, I destroyed 70% of them. And the people who had depression were much more accurate in their estimate. And it is generally thought that depression has kind of been carried down in the genome, partially because there is a survival value to it. You're probably familiar with the whole field or the term evolutionary psychology. I really like something Noam Chomsky once said. He said that one of the problems with evolutionary psychology as a scientific discipline is that it basically tries to explain certain things about us as being the result of evolution. But the problem with that is everything we are is the result of evolution. In some ways, it's just kind of stating the obvious. But asking why this thing continued in the human genome, because depression is a funny thing to have survived evolution, because depression does put you at greater risk of suicide. Now, suicide and depression are not synonymous topics, but and there's a lot of people who commit suicide who are not clinically depressed, but there's other reasons that we don't need to go into here. But suffice it to say, though, overwhelming number, vast majority of suicides are generally thought to at least be linked to some form of depression. So it's odd that this would have survived in the human genome, right? You would tend to think people who have this condition would eventually just kind of died out. But depression does seem to serve, paradoxically, a certain self-protective function, in addition to being pathological, and in addition to, yes, sometimes depression pushes you off the rails and you end your own life. But it also does cause people to be more perceptive to threats, to be more perceptive to danger in their environment. Depression is closely linked to anxiety in ways that we don't fully understand yet, but it is very interesting that the same psychometric drugs, or I'm sorry, psychotropic drugs, the same psychotropic drugs are used to treat depression as well as anxiety. In other words, it's the same class of medications. So if you take Effexor, for example, for depression, it's an antidepressant. If you take it for anxiety, it's an anti-anxiety. Either way, it's the same drug. So these conditions did seem to serve some kind of beneficial mechanism in sort of making us pessimistic in a self-protective kind of way. A person who is completely carefree and happy-go-lucky, that person may very well not survive to pass on their DNA because they don't notice the saber-toothed tiger, or if they notice it, they think, well, how bad could it really be? But depression, of course, one of the things it does is it gives you a very dark outlook on life. And as dreadful as that is to experience, it is thought by some researchers that that actually may have served a protective function in our ancestors.
Well, that's fascinating. Now, I assume by implication then that there's at least an important genetic basis. If it's not invisible to evolution, there's a genetic basis for depression.
Depression is thought to have a genetic component in a lot of people. Yes. We are a long way from isolating a depressive gene, right? Like, and one of the things you find if you do a lot of reading on research in genetics is that it is very rare that a single gene causes anything. I mean, especially when it comes to behavior and personality. But one of the major indicators that depression is strongly genetic is studies of people who have been adopted. And so time and time again, and again, you know, your viewers can dig into this on their own time and at their own pace in researching it. But time and time again, we find in people who have been adopted that these are people who, in many cases, have never even met their biological parents. They suffer from horrible depression. Their adoptive parents don't. And then eventually it's discovered that their biological parents do. That is one of, I mean, there's many other indicators that there's a genetic component to this. But depression doesn't have to be genetic. That's also important to stress. Depression can develop as a result of one's experiences. And so there's a certain group of people who are strongly genetically predisposed to depression. But even if you aren't predisposed to it, it can develop in the same way that any illness can develop.
Is it correct that Churchill described depression, his own depression, as a black dog? Is that right?
Churchill very famously called depression a black dog, although he didn't actually coin that phrase. That phrase actually came from the English writer Samuel Johnson, who described his own depression as a black dog. I don't know if Churchill, I assume Churchill was either quoting Johnson deliberately or maybe had just heard the phrase somewhere, but it was Churchill who popularized the phrase, yeah.
So if you were going to like personify depression from your own experiential perspective, what would you describe it as?
I have always come I have always thought of depression as, and again, all of the metaphors are, you know, they only convey so much, but I've always come to think of it as wading through a swamp is how I've always felt of it. You're just very tired and you're just very exhausted and everything is bleak and horrible. And you feel like you're just wading through cold, thick, greasy, dark waters. And that's how I've always thought of it, trudging through a swamp. I haven't thought of depression so much as a personified being like a dog or something. I've thought of it more as just this all-encompassing environment. Some people think of depression as just a fog, right? A thick fog that kind of envelops you. But I mean, I've never attempted suicide, and I consider that to be a great achievement. A lot of people would would hardly think of that as an achievement, right? They would think, well, yeah, of course I haven't attempted suicide. But for a person who's suffered from depression for over 40 years, to have never had a suicide attempt is kind of like, it's a pretty awesome thing. But I've certainly thought about it many, many times, countless times throughout my life. And the term that is often used in psychology for that is ideation, suicidal ideation. And again, that is one of the classic symptoms of depression, suicidal ideation. I remember talking to a psychiatrist once, not as a patient, but I met this person at a conference and we were chatting a little bit. And I remember he said to me, you know what? We all want to die at some point. We all want to die sooner. I remember thinking to myself, I know you're the psychiatrist and I'm just the ordinary guy, but I think you're wrong about that. I don't think most people do ever want to die. I think that's an unusual feeling. If that feeling was really common, I don't think our species would still be around. It's one of the things that causes me to, I look in wonder when I look at the horrible conditions in the third world, for example. I saw a documentary not long ago about the shipbreaking industry in India and Bangladesh. And these young men, it's all young men, they tear apart these gigantic ocean liners and oil cargo ships. They tear them apart largely by hand with blowtorches and stuff. And it is horrifyingly dangerous work. They're breathing in toxic fumes all day long. The safety standards are non-existent. The wages are just essentially wage slavery. And I watch that and I think, why don't they just give up?
Because the healthcare is so good.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I look at that, but seriously, and I think like people have this incredible ability to want to live, even in the most appalling conditions. The best example, or the best book, rather, I can recommend for that, the book is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, where he was in a Nazi concentration camp. He was a young doctor, and it was near the end of the war. I think it was 1944. He was sent to a concentration camp. And he writes this book about his experience, how even in the Nazi concentration camp, the vast majority of prisoners didn't consider suicide. It just didn't cross their minds. Now, I think, really? That would have been my first thought. Second, I'm in the concentration camp, I'm going to charge one of the guards and see if I can get shot so that this whole thing is over. But that's how a depressed person thinks. That's my take on it. I think a healthy person has an overwhelming urge to live, which is a precious gift that we have as human beings, and that all living creatures seem to have, right? Yeah. They all want to keep going.
Well, we've talked about some of the benefits of depression, interestingly, and also the challenge here. How do you appropriate it yourself? How does one live with depression?
Well, whenever anybody, asks me for my insight or suggestions or whatever, I mean, my first response is always that depression is a medical problem, and it must be approached medically. There are far too many people, even in today's world where there's a lot more awareness of mental illness, there's far too many people that think that depression is something that can be dealt with just, with a lot of love and some friends and whatever else, a good attitude.
Or stick-to-itiveness.
Right, yeah, or stick-to-itiveness, or,
charismatic prayer.
Well, sure.
Like spiritualizing it as demonic, or
yeah. I mean, that's true of all mental illness, right? That there's a long history in human society of having a very superstitious view of mental illness. People with epilepsy, with schizophrenia, with depression, it's thought that that was supernatural in origin in a way that we typically didn't think of physical illness. But I think the first thing is there has to be some kind of medical intervention, not necessarily antidepressant drugs, but I am a big believer in the importance of those drugs. But a consultation with a doctor, with an actual medical doctor, by the way. Too many people, in my opinion, are instead going to chiropractors or naturopaths or people who really don't have any medical training or knowledge at all about these kinds of issues. You have to see a medical doctor. I highly recommend that you ask the medical doctor to refer you to a specialist, and so medical treatment. But equally important is psychotherapy, talk therapy, where you are regularly meeting with a trained. Again, it has to be somebody who has training in mental illness, whether that's a psychologist or a psychiatrist, or again, there's different terms that get used and we don't have time to get into all that, but somebody who has training in dealing with this area. Clinical counselor is another term you'll hear. And I also find just self-awareness, educating yourself. If you know the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams, based on the Oliver Sacks experience, there's a fascinating scene in that movie where Robert De Niro, who plays the patient who's suffering from this neurological disease, he starts having these horrible convulsions, and Robin Williams, who plays the doctor, he's filming him, right? Like for his research, he wants to put the camera down and instead just help him. And which is the impulse we would all have. And Robert De Niro says, no, learn, learn, learn. He just kind of slurs the word learn as he's kind of convulsing like this. He wants him to keep filming, in other words, right? Don't try to help me right now, learn. I have found that to be incredibly empowering, just learning more and more about this condition. There's fantastic books on the subject. There's fantastic documentary films on the subject. I find that's also very important. And just being open about the problem. Like people who struggle with, with diabetes, or people who are dealing with leukemia or any other condition, they have to tell the people around them that I have this condition. Same is true with any kind of mental illness, making sure the people around you know that you have this problem. And not that it's their job to fix it, but simply that they can sort of support you as you kind of struggle through it.
Right. That's excellent. Thank you. I want to touch on two more topics as we begin to wind down. The first one kind of brings us into the area of healthcare, a field that you now work in. I think it was 2019, medical assistance in dying legislation was passed in Canada. So you could correct me on the year if I'm wrong, but and so this is.
I think you're right. I think it was
Yeah.
2019. Yeah.
So this legislation for access to euthanasia, to medical assistance in dying, and now there's a conversation going on about extending the application, the availability of this service from people who are facing imminent death to a much broader application of quality of life. And immediately I start thinking about the potential application of that to people who have severe clinical depression, which is a concern for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to hear your thoughts on sort of the nexus, the point at which euthanasia and medical care meet with depression.
Yeah, I'm very worried about it too. I don't know if this has already happened, but my understanding, I haven't done a lot of reading on this topic, but my understanding is that there have already been people who received assisted suicide or doctor-assisted death, however you want to phrase it, in British Columbia because of psychiatric disorders. My understanding is that there've already been some cases of that. it already happens in other countries in the world, as I'm sure you know. Switzerland, Belgium are two that come to mind. The Netherlands, where people with psychiatric disorders, sometimes depression, sometimes other conditions, they apply for and they receive assisted suicide. I'm very troubled by it, because it's one of the kind of classic conditions that's been necessary for assisted suicide. Now of course, a person may oppose assisted suicide on other grounds, religious or ethical or moral grounds. That's a different topic altogether. But I'm saying, even if we have assisted suicide, even if a person agrees with the general principle, one of the classic conditions has been that the person requesting assisted suicide is able to think clearly and rationally, and that they are capable of making an informed decision. And so people who are really troubled by mental illness being a part of this process, they sort of point out with some justification that a person suffering from mental illness may not be capable of thinking rationally. Wanting to die, in the case of depression certainly, is actually part of the illness. Now, having said that, though, I have to say, I personally have many times in my life felt depression that was so utterly horrifying that it would simply not have been an option to keep living if I had always felt that way. My cat's over here, by the way, in case your audience is wondering what that is.
Caspian's tail.
That's right. That's my cat, Prince Caspian. I have felt depression that was so horrifying that it just isn't an option to keep living for me. Now, the reason that I'm still here is I have, I'm sorry about that. I have always known that in my own experience, my depressions are mercifully short in duration. There are people who suffer from depressions that go on for months, for example. I don't even know how those people last, to be honest. And some don't, of course. My depressions tend to be in days rather than weeks or months. So, but also, you know, suicide is not that easy. I mean, it's not that easy. And it's not something that as I said to you before, I've never actually even made an attempt on suicide. This is one argument, and I know we're not talking here about firearms, but this is one of the arguments you hear against easy access to firearms. It makes suicide frighteningly easy for people. And a lot of cases of suicide, the person, they do it almost as an impulsive act, because in that moment, they're in such agony, they just can't take it. So I guess I say that just to say, I am not in favor, not that anybody is asking my opinion, you know, well, you are, but you know, it's not like the government is asking my opinion, but I'm not really in favor of mental illness being a part of the conversation for medical assistance in dying. I'm troubled by it. But I also recognize, having lived the horror of mental illness, I recognize and I'm sympathetic to people who have been in a place that is so horrifying, whether it's from depression or schizophrenia, which is another absolutely horrifying disease, where they simply can't bear living. I have a lot of sympathy for that. So I don't know what the answer is, to be honest with you. And it's also a bit of a stereotype to say that mentally ill people can't make an informed decision, right? Like, to some extent, in many cases, that's true. They can't, but many of them can. And so I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm troubled by it. And I think what we need to spend a lot more time and energy on is treatments for mental illness. You know, I'd love to see that get a lot more funding.
All right, I want to come back to conclude to a topic that I referred to at the beginning, really, which is the link between how depression is perceived and Christianity. So I'll give an example where I sort of I had this image growing up and when I was an undergraduate about Martin Luther, right? The great founder of father of the Protestant Reformation, where he was
The
all,
great heretic.
yeah, that, or how
No,
about
I'm just trying to be funny.
yeah, well, anti-Semite. I mean, I have people who say, well, anti-Judaic, okay, whatever. But
Yeah.
he did publish a book called The Jews and Their Lies in 1545. So he didn't end well.
Quite infamously, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I certainly, I'm not interested in hagiography, like treating him as a, the kind of saintly figure. He was a very flawed human being. But see, the narrative went like this, that he was deeply depressed and concerned about his salvation. And then he discovered the doctrine of justification. And by reading Romans 1, and he had what's called the Tower experience somewhere between 1512 and 1517. And then, the weight was lifted off his shoulders, and like in Charles Wesley's hymn, but that he could suddenly, now the light came down from heaven and he never had any more concerns than that. And he was safe and confident in justification. But then I remember reading, no, it wasn't like that, in fact. And one passage stuck out for me from Philip Melanchthon, who was a younger colleague of Luther's at Wittenberg, where he describes Luther as finding him curled up on his bed. Like, this is years after the Reformation, right? But curled up on his bed, just in anguish about the prospect of being the object of reprobation of the hidden God. So this thing that he never really kind of got over. And so I always looked at that as kind of a theological framing and expression of some deep, clinical depression. And it doesn't fit into the narrative, right? That you're supposed to have this triumphal Christian life. And yet, when you go back and you read the book of Job, or you read the Psalms, or you read Ecclesiastes, you find the ringing theme of depression time and again. So I just wonder, from your perspective, how do you think about depression and the Christian faith?
Well, I think you touched on it earlier. I remember growing up, well, with you, obviously, we grew up together, growing up in the Pentecostal church, and essentially being told that depression was essentially a moral failing, right? That it just showed that you didn't have enough faith, and that the normative state was to just be happy all the time. It's important to note, though, that in that regard, the fundamentalist or evangelical Christians, the charismatic Christians, they were no different than secular society. So whether a father or a mother, I say father because I think dads were more likely to talk like this back in the 70s, whether a father said to his kid, "Stop being depressed, just trust God," or whether a father said, "Stop being depressed, all you need is a kick in the ass." I mean, either way, to me, it's kind of the same mindset, that you should be happy and just stop being depressed. So I think that was largely, it was a very difficult environment to grow up in as a depressed person, growing up in a Pentecostal church. But I want to stress, I don't think it was particularly different than growing up in a secular environment would have been, because there just wasn't an understanding of depression as a serious condition, right? People who had no religious faith at all, who had never been to a church or synagogue or anything in their lives, they were also saying, "Oh, just snap out of it. Stop being depressed. Cheer up, you big goof," right? So more troubling to me is the tendency that a lot of religious communities have, and we touched on this before too, to view mental disorders in supernatural terms. That to me is a very insidious thing, because it means that people with medical problems are not getting the treatment that they need. So some of these people who say, well, if you have cancer, of course you have to go get chemotherapy, they will then turn around and say, your depression, there must be a spirit of depression on you. We need to pray it out. I like you, I was very conscious of a lot of the portrayals in the Bible of depression. And one of my favorite characters in the whole Bible is King Saul, who, and I think the reason I like that character so much, keeping in mind, I recognize he did a lot of horrible things. I'm not viewing him as a role model, but he's a very sympathetic character to me. And
Hey, well, I'll just say that everybody loves David, and he did horrible stuff too. In
he
fact,
was worse than Saul.
yeah, Saul killed his thousands, but David killed his tens of thousands. So
exactly. David was 10 times worse, mathematically speaking. But Saul, early in the story of Saul, we're told that he was repeatedly oppressed by an evil spirit sent by the Lord. And a lot of people look at that today as what was probably depression. The indicator to me that it's probably depression is that David's music would make him feel better, which to me makes it sound a lot like he suffered from some kind of horrible, debilitating depression. And so it's always been there. Like, depression has always been a part of the history of Christianity, because it's been a part of the human history. Incidentally, it's not only Christianity that has the problem of telling people they shouldn't be depressed, they should be happy. I read an interesting essay, actually not long ago, coincidentally, by a Muslim imam. He's in, I believe he's in France, Western Europe anyway. And he was basically imploring Muslims to not be depressed because they need to just submit to Allah. Like, it's the same story. It's just a slightly different spin on it because it's a different tradition. You'll hear the same thing in Hinduism. You'll hear it in Buddhism. You'll hear it in most of the religions. Like, the idea that if you're really practicing the faith in whatever ways that entails, then you should not be depressed, right? I mean, Buddha was not depressed under the banyan tree. He was not depressed. He felt perfect harmony, and so can you, right? Like this. So this is one problem, I think. But on the other hand, religion, not just Christianity, but faith in general, right, can have a very powerful healing effect. I mean, and certainly Christianity, prayer, the Bible, meditation, going to church services, those things were all very much a part of my struggle against depression as I was growing up. So it was complex. It in some ways it was very bad for me to be a depressed person in that environment, but in some ways I took a lot of comfort out of that environment.
Atari video games didn't hurt either.
Well, one of the problems with depression is that it does take away your pleasure in ordinary activities. This is actually one of the textbook symptoms of depression: anhedonia, an inability to experience pleasure. So even something as fun and as pleasurable and as enjoyable as a video game, and I'm a big video gamer, as you know, to this day, you don't really want to do it anymore, right? And that's one way you can sometimes tell depression is like, I don't take any pleasure in the things I used to enjoy.
Concluding thought, for a person who says they've never been depressed or just don't really know it, like, what's the one thing you'd want them to understand? Just one thing. Most important thing.
I think the most important thing is to understand that depression is an illness. It's the same thing that I think an alcoholic would want people to understand about alcoholism, or that a drug addict would want people to understand about addiction. It's a disease. It's an illness. I think that in one sentence, it would be that.
That's a good sentence on which to end then. Rick, thanks a lot for this conversation. It's been fascinating and I think very beneficial for a lot of people. And I know a lot of people, of course, struggle with this very issue. So it's not just head knowledge, it's also experiential, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You bet.